Hello everyone. I want to share a flow I built to batch update a SharePoint list using external data. This builds on the batch create flow from the Tachytelic blog. So if you want a deeper explanation on the batch API calls, then you can visit some of the blog posts or videos in the description.
Let's get started. If you've used Flow for a while, you're probably familiar with the basic method of updating SharePoint lists. You run some actions that generate data, or you connect to a data source. You query the SharePoint list for records matching some criteria for each row of the updated data. And finally, you update the matching records one at a time. And this will perform this for every single record in your data source, every single row in Excel. This works well enough, especially if you only need to update a few rows or a few records in SharePoint. However, if you've ever had to update 1,000 or more rows, you'll notice it takes a lot more time. You might also run into licensing issues where you exceed the daily action limit on your account because it's taking at least 2 actions to update each and every row. So, if you have 1,000 rows in Excel, then it takes at least 2,000 actions to update it. You could maybe manage a list that needs several thousand updates a day, but let's hope you don't have to manage several lists like that on a single account. In short, this isn't a very scalable setup. That's where flows with batch actions come in. Instead of taking 2 actions to update every single row, we can update up to 1,000 rows with every 4 to 5 actions and reduce flow runtimes. So let's go through how some of this works from the top. First, we need to load all the possible list records that could be getting an update. In most cases, this means you'll load the whole list. We need to load this for a later step where we will match the current SharePoint ID to the updated data. I have this set to load a list of up to 200,000 records. And of course, the pagination for these actions is maxed out at 100,000. I've sorted both actions by ID and then set the filter in the second action to only select records where the ID is greater than the last ID pulled by the first action. If you need to load more than 200,000 records, then you can keep adding more of these get items with a similar filter condition, just with this expression set to the last ID from the previous step. Some of you may know it can take a long time, like more than 25 minutes to load a full 100,000 records. Later, I'll show some ways to process these actions in parallel, where you can make this stage go about as fast as you want, depending on how much effort you want to put into this flow and into your setup. On to the rest of the flow. Here we have our external data coming from Excel. Updated data can really come from any data source with a Power Automate action, or even from an API if you make an HTTP request action. But Excel works really well for a simple example here. Again, I have the pagination set to the maximum 100,000 for this action. And I also have this inside a do until loop. So if you have more than 100,000 rows of updated data in Excel, then it will repeat these actions for every batch of 100,000 rows. And it will repeat them until the Excel get data action returns less than this number of rows. Once it does that, it knows that it's the last loop that needs to run. If you change the source of updated data, just make sure that this conditional still makes sense for the batch size of updated data coming in, and make sure to change the body part of this length expression to the output of whatever your get data action is. And next, this part may look familiar if you've seen the batch create from previous videos. So this is where you input the information for the list you're targeting for updates, the site address, list name, and the batch size. So the maximum size of batches we can send to SharePoint to request to update is 1,000. Beyond that, we may start to get errors, so it's best to just leave that how it is. And after that, we've got the template section, which is the template format for each row of data in the batch request. The only difference between batch create and batch update here are this items ID section, where the ID between the pipes here will be replaced with each ID from SharePoint that matches the data coming from Excel. And then there's this if match setting that had to be added for batch update. The row data between the pipes, again, just like in batch create, it will be replaced with the updated data. Next, the flow splits to parallel branches. Each branch will process all the updates for each set of records loaded by the get items actions back at the top. So if you add another 100,000 get items action here because your list is greater than 200,000 records, then you'll need to also copy one of these branch scopes and then go and create another branch here and select here in the My Clipboard to insert a copy of that branch. And then I'm just going to change a few of the things here. Change the name here to the third. And there's two things you'll have to change inside the scope whenever you're copying it over. The first is this value here. It will still be the get items from the previous branch. So you'll have to change that. In this instance, you change it to the third get items. And then down at the bottom here, for some reason, there's this expression that maintains the same send batch identifier from the previous branch. So you just have to go in here and change that to match this send batch that's immediately above it. But let's focus back on how these branches actually process and batch update the data. So you could say that these first two actions are key here. So this select action takes the output of current list data from one of the get items actions at the top and reformats the collection of data from the output to a list of primary key values, where each key has the entire record of data associated with it as an object value. For this, you must select a value or column that is unique for every row and that both SharePoint and your external updated data share. If you need to combine two or more columns to create a primary key where each one is unique for each record, you can just select on the left side here. And when you're inputting this for the specific get items that this is for, so I see this is for the first 100,000, then you see email's already there, so I can just add in date, and then that will combine the two and basically concatenate them for the primary key. And then the reason I need the second action here is because this output is actually an array. It's an array of objects indexed by this primary key. And arrays can only be selected by position, so by number. And I'm in a later step going to need to be able to select these by the name of this primary key. So what this does is it removes the formatting for the array and then creates a giant JSON object. So it's a giant object of many different objects for each row. And what that looks like, I can show you over here. And you see, here's the email. And then this is an entire object holding all the record details. And you see, here's the second email with all those record details and so on all the way through.
Next, we have this generate data action, which is very similar to the generate data action from the batch create flows. We have this metadata field that you don't want to delete. You probably just want to leave it the way it is because it's what formats all these records the correct way for the eventual batch update action. And the other important field we have right below that you probably don't want to remove is the ID field. And you can see here in the expression, what I'm doing is I'm calling on the outputs from the previous action that I just showed. And I'm using the fact that I have all those records now indexed by a primary key to do a special kind of lookup or a special way to identify which record IDs from SharePoint I want to insert in here to match with the new data from Excel. So, this is an email value from Excel, and what this is doing is it's saying if it finds this email value in the list of records from this action, then take that sort of row, that record, and take the ID from that record and input it here with the new data, which will then be used later in the batch update action to update that specific record in SharePoint. So overall, it works a lot like a type of VLOOKUP between SharePoint and Excel. It takes the key value from the current Excel row that you input here and looks for a matching value in SharePoint based on the key value that you input up here. So if you do go to edit this flow for your own use, just make sure that whatever SharePoint value or column you're putting up here, that you change this out in this expression to whatever Excel column or columns will match that value. So I have an example in the notes here that show how you can do that with multiple columns if you need to use multiple columns. But yeah, again, works kind of like a VLOOKUP. And then for the rest of these columns or rest of these fields here, you just want to make sure that each of these keys, each of these titles here, match the column titles that you have in SharePoint. So, I have my date, my title, my email, my status, and so on. And then I also just added these in here to show some special cases where if you have a hyphen, a space, certain symbols in your SharePoint column names, then you will want to go ahead and check over here in list settings, and you'll want to go to whatever that column title is with the special character, and then you can go into, once you're at the edit column section in the settings, you can go up into the URL here, go to the end, and you'll be able to find what the actual name of the column is more on the back end. And you need to use this as the name in the flow. So if I want to add the check-in column here, I'd post that in here and then put one or whatever dynamic content I want to use to update that column. Then before we go to the filter array, I have to note here if this expression doesn't find a record that matches the key value from Excel in the SharePoint records listed from this action, then it will return a null. And so in the filter array action down here, I'm checking all those ID values. If it's null, then I don't want to include it in the rest of the flow. And these ID values could be null because it's not finding it just in this specific batch of 100,000 records, because remember, this branch is matched up with this 100,000 get items, so it could be in the second 100,000 over here on this side, or it could just not be in SharePoint at all.
Finally, we get to the section that puts all the data into batch sizes that you specified in the settings, and then formats the data into the correct template for the SharePoint batch request, and sends the batch to SharePoint for processing and returns the results of the batch request here. Now it keeps doing this in a loop until the last iteration where the remaining number of updated data records is less than your set batch size and settings. If you want more information on this section, you can look up Polly's blog over at TachyTelic. The batch create is very similar to this. So he goes through more details on how this section works. Now that I've explained the batch update method, we can do a little comparison between the standard row by row update and our batch update. So I have my Excel list here of external data with all these statuses set to in progress. And then I have over in SharePoint all the records set to pending. So I'm going to update all 1000 rows to in progress using the standard method. And just to make sure this is competitive here, I've put the concurrency up to the maximum 50 parallel branches running at once. So it's running 50 of these at a time. That'll speed it up as much as I can for the standard method. Now, I probably won't make you wait here. I'll just skip several minutes or however long this takes. All right, for 1000 rows, that standard method took about 4 minutes to complete, even with the concurrency set to the maximum. And of course, it took over 2000 actions to complete that. Now let's go back to our Excel sheet. We'll change this to complete. Have all those external data records say complete. Have all these set to in progress here. And let's go back to our batch create. So let's see how long this takes to update the same 1000 rows. So our batch update ran successfully. If I go over to SharePoint, you can see over here in the status column, all these are now set to complete. I can check the filter, no more in progress, no more pending. And looking at our individual row by row method again, the standard method, this took about 4 minutes to run, whereas our batch method took a little over 1 minute. And that 3 minute difference may not seem like a lot for 1000 rows, but if you have to update something like 20,000 rows, that could be up to an hour's difference in run times. And of course, this method is doing things in less than 20 actions per 1000 rows, whereas this is taking a little over 2000 actions per 1000 rows, which means you could do a lot more with a lot more lists in a single account using this method over using the standard method. Now, if you're working with less than, say, 50,000 SharePoint records in the existing list, or if you don't care much for speed improvements on very large data sets, then this setup may serve you well enough, and you may want to skip to the end for flow download information or just look in the description. But if you're working with 100,000 or several hundreds of thousands of records, you may need to keep the update run times lower, and then you may want to continue watching. So as I mentioned before, some of you may know that it'll take quite a while to load 100,000 records in each of these get items actions, especially if you're loading them sequentially like I have set up here. For instance, I tried just for the heck of it, going through and loading 200,000 rows, and it took about 25 minutes per 100,000 action. Some people may be okay with this, but many of you may have use cases or refreshes or updates you want to do where you can't have the flow running for that long, or there can't be that much of a gap. So the main two ways you can reduce the load time at this bottleneck here is to either reduce the amount of records that you need to load. So say you know that only records created in the past 3 months, you have more recent activity that is going to be updated and all your older activity isn't going to be updated, then you could add a filter query in both of these saying to only get the records where the created date is greater than UTC now minus 90 days or whatever. And that'll work a little bit. But the main way that we're going to reduce the runtime or the load time here is by making it so that you can run these in parallel much more. So there's a couple ways to do that. There's a kind of quicker, easier way, and then there's a more methodical way that can get you a much higher speed boost if you need it. So if I go over to the simple example with just 3 branches, I can show you this, which is using a pre-existing column in SharePoint. If you have a pre-existing column that has set values for every single record, status column is pretty good for that. Even if you have some records that don't have a status, you could add an extra get items here and say when status is equal to null. But once you have something that has these kind of set values in each record, you can split up the get items into separate branches based on that column by filtering for each value in that column. And because these are in separate branches, they all load at the same time instead of sequentially. So if we go over here, if these were in 2 separate branches, they'd each load at the same time and only take 25 minutes instead of the 50 minutes. So the more branches that we add here, the faster this load time will be. So something like 3 branches split on something like a status column may work for the somewhat larger data sets of a couple 100,000 records. But what if you have a lot more data? Something like, say, 2 million records, which is definitely possible in SharePoint. The max capacity is 30 to 31 million records. So for that large of a data set, even if you had the 3 branches all loading the list at the same time, it would take almost 3 hours. At that point, the batch flow might be worse than the standard row by row method if you only have a few hundred updates to make a day. But I have found myself in similar situations where I have a larger data set, maybe not 2 million records, but something like that, and I need to make several tens of thousands of updates a day. So yeah, let's say you have a 2 million record list and you need to update 10, 20,000 records every day. How might you do that in a fast and efficient way? Well, what you can do is you can generally just add more parallel branches to the batch update method. And what that looks like is it's pretty similar to what we did with the splitting the list up by statuses, only instead we're going to have something a bit more methodical where we can filter based on a set column that we make in the SharePoint list. And I'll show you that here. It's a bit more custom. It's called RAND1250, and it's just like what I named it, where each record has a random number, 1 to 50. And the way this works is it's a number column with a default calculated value set to this formula that will be available in the video description. And this will apply to any new records created. So say I go here, I click new record, rand 1 to 50 generated 37. Then I can go refresh. I can click new, and now it's 44. And that will be a different number for every new record created on SharePoint, or created on an app that you've connected to the SharePoint list, or created in a flow connected to this list. So that handles all the new values coming in. But let's say you still have plenty of older records in here and you just created this column. All these are going to be blank because it only generates the number for new columns created. In that situation, you'll need to export the entire list to Excel, save it as a query, and then you'll get something that looks like this. And if you've created this column, you'll have this here, but all these will be blank. And you'll need to add this other formula that I'll make available in the video description. Apply that to the top row, and then apply it to all the rows below that by clicking on that bottom right corner. And so that gets you random numbers 1 through 50 for all the records in your list. Of course, now you have this Excel sheet with all the random values, but you do have to export it over to SharePoint. So for that, you can use the slower batch update method, slower, simpler. But you only have to do this once to apply all the random numbers back into the SharePoint list. You'll put in that column here, and then you'll add in the dynamic content from Excel here, and you'll be able to set that up and then run this once, and you'll end up with your new SharePoint list with all these numbers filled in for all the records. And from there, you can then set up something like what I have in this example. So I only did 5 branches because I don't want to just have my screen be maxed out and make this hard to follow. But anyways, you have this with rand 1 to 50 set to anything less than 11. So any records with numbers 1 through 10 will be loaded through this get items. And then for next one, of course, have 11 through 20. Any records with those numbers will be loaded in this one, and so on. And of course, with the maximum of 50 branches, you could have up to 50 get items with each of these. Instead of greater than and less than, they just be set to rand 1 to 50 equal to 1, 2, 3, and so on. And you do have to create the extra scope batches down here that correspond to each of those get items. So what I showed you earlier, where you copy to clipboard, create the extra branch, and then paste it and reset, this value and then the value down here. But let's say you're extra eager, you really need that speed improvement, and you go through and create all 50 parallel branches. Then for that 2 million record list, you should be loading, let's see, 2 million divided by 50, you'll have 40,000 records to load per get items action here. If the original example that I showed had 100,000 records loading in every 25 minutes, that means that this part should be done in less than 15 minutes. And then this with 50 different parallel branches would definitely load any amount of updates you have, several tens of thousands, in a matter of minutes. So that means that you could handle very large updates in less than 20 minutes. All right. So that went through both the kind of simplified template version and the ways to add some extra speed to it. I have made this template version available through a link in the description that leads to a Drive file where you can download the flow documents. And then once you download that zip file of flow documents, then you can go through the usual import process and upload wherever you have that zip file stored. You can load it in here, and then you'll get this beautiful template here. I've also provided a secondary option where I put all of these actions inside a scope, and you can get the code from that document, and you can do something here where you just open up to the clipboard, and once you've copied that code, you can hit Control V and paste it here, and that will add the scope with the entire flow built into it here if you, for some reason, just want to quickly get it without going through the import process.
All right, I hope you found this demo really helpful. Maybe you have a few things you didn't know that you could do with SharePoint before, and now you have some sort of project that is now feasible with this extra fast, extra efficient use of SharePoint and Power Automate. Other than that, have a good day.